The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. This is the second day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in June 2021. And I'd like to share some more of Hakuin for two reasons. First of all, on day 2, it's often the most difficult day for people doing practice in their earlier years. Somehow the first day is usually taken up with just getting settled in, trying to get going on the practice. And on the second day, the practice does get going, but we start meeting heavy waters. Unless we're quite experienced, and even if we're quite experienced, we can meet some heavy waters, but we understand through experience how to deal with them. And how to deal with them? Through becoming one with the moment, just as it appears to be, and offering it what is known as radical acceptance. You don't have to like it, but it's an admission that, okay, this is how it feels right now. So I'll work with it. And that's a very good metaphor for practice, really, because as we become more and more experienced in our Zen meditation practice, particularly if we've been serious about it, we become more flexible, more able to ride the waves, particularly when they start getting high enough. We got to surf them instead of just floating on them. And this is one of the benefits of Zen practice. Another reason why I wanted to share this particular story that Hakuin writes about in his book, Poison Blossoms in a Thicket of Thorns, is because it is a danger to people in practice. We come to practice out of some level of challenge, usually. People who come out of fascination with perhaps becoming a Zen person don't normally last very long in the practice. It takes something in the way of deeper motivation to keep us going. And then if we have had challenges growing up, as many people have, there's a very high proportion of people, certainly in the United States where it's been studied, who have what are known as adverse childhood experiences, where the caregiving that would have allowed us to develop as harmonious, happy human beings, understanding that while life has some challenges, it also has some good points, and that people are in general good, because that was our earliest childhood experience. But many people have, as again, what I said is called adverse childhood experiences, where the parents are distracted or absent, and there's no dedicated caregiver that has constant positive affection or continuing positive affection. It doesn't have to be constant, but continuing positive affection and nurturing of the infant. And that impacts our worldview. And perhaps it is responsible for the strife we're seeing all over the world these days. At any rate, one aspect of practice that once we get to a more advanced state, and if we have experienced adverse childhood experiences, it's not going to be easy. We're going to maybe remember some things or have certain conditioning around certain experiences. And so Zen practice can be challenging. When I went to my first sesshin, I was living in Turkey at the time, and I commuted to Rochester, New York, to the Rochester Zen Center for sesshin. the only thing I cared about, it was a 4-day sesshin, was just surviving the schedule. I don't do well with lack of sleep, and certainly coming across a number of time zones, I was going to be upside down, which actually made it rather easy to do yaza. And it was a struggle. It was a struggle all the 4 days. But to my amazement, on the day after sesshin, the morning after sesshin, where the zendo is opened up to all members, and there's this wonderful deep energy in the zendo, and I went down to sit informally because there's no formal sitting then. And to my amazement, I sat for 2 hours without moving. And then I went back to Turkey, and I couldn't for 3 weeks bring myself even to move over the threshold of the door leading into the room where my mat and cushion were. It was as if there was some invisible force going, whoa. And it took me 3 weeks before I was actually able to go and do any more zazen. And zazen was always very difficult for me because of my history. Yet I understood at a deep level, very, very significantly, that zazen and continuing my Zen training was the only thing that was going to take me out of that suffering. And so it has been. But it was a struggle for many, many, many years. One of the things that is not so paid attention to in American Zen, I'm not sure it's even paid attention these days to in Japanese Zen, despite the fact that Hakuin was Japanese, and he was a very big proponent of what is called the long maturation, post-Satori training. His Dharma successor Tori also was very, very strong about that. And I'd like to share with you a story that Hakuin writes about in this book about an elderly priest who failed to heed that. And here is his story. In the Shotoku era, which was 1711 to 1715, there was a priest in Edo, or Tokyo these days, who called himself Zenkai. He is said to have been a nephew of Bucho Rojin. He began his Zen practice at the age of 23 and experienced a Kensho. Unfortunately, however, he did not encounter a real teacher and never learned about post-Satori practice. Attached to the understanding he had attained, he continued to practice withered tree sitting. And this is something that I've seen many times over, not just practicing withered tree sitting, but simply abandoning sitting. Sometimes what motivates us to come to Zen practice is a more superficial level of pain. And so people go ahead and practice until they've had a Kensho, and somehow having that Kensho takes some of the pressure off. And I know a number of people who were actually in residence at the Rochester Zen Center in the old days when I was there as well, who have told me that they're no longer sitting, which is sad because they were quite dedicated people. And each one of them, I know, had a Kensho. But when the initial motivating force for doing Zen practice is relieved to whatever degree, it's so many things are tempting to draw us away from that potential deepening practice that would really lead to true liberation. And that is apparently what happened to this Zenkai. Attached to the understanding he attained, he continued to practice withered trees sitting, but he lamented how difficult it still was for him to control the workings of his mind. He needed to find a teacher to guide him. He decided to enter the mountains of Kumano on the Kii Peninsula, cut himself off from the outside world, and devote himself to an austere training regimen. On his way, he passed through Awano in Mino province, thinking to stop for a while with several priests of his acquaintance who were residing there. By the way, remember that this was an era in Japan where there really weren't significant Zen teachers. Hakuin became one thanks to Dokyo Eitan, who was known as the old man of Rojin, the old man of Shoju Hermitage. And he was a lone monk priest who lived in this very small little building. It was the kind of building that farmers lived in, a little house, mainly just one room. And everything was done in that room, eating, sleeping, and cooking, and so on and so forth. No furniture, of course. But that was how things were in Japan. Nowadays, people in Japan have Western style furniture, which has an interesting result, by the way. The older generations of Japanese people have a certain body proportion, and their legs are a bit shorter than one would expect from the size of their full height. That appears to have been as a result of the fact that traditionally people lived on the floor. They sat in seiza position a good part of their lives, and apparently that impacted the level of nourishment that could get to their lower legs, and so their legs were shorter than one would expect otherwise. And nowadays, when the younger people sit in chairs, sleep in beds, and essentially use Western furniture and don't sit seiza on the tatami floors. In fact, in wealthier homes, there's usually just one room that has tatami, and the other rooms have got wooden floors or even carpet. And their legs are in proportion to their bodies. At any rate, this man, Zenkai, on his way to do this solo deep training, and that was basically what was available, really, until he met Hakuin. By that time, I think Dokyo Eitan had died, and his only other successor had also died young. So Hakuin was the only person of significant training and experience that could guide people in more advanced practice, in the post-satori practice. And this man had not heard of him. And so he got together with these priest friends, and they convinced him that he should build a hermitage there in Mino and stay there rather than going off on his own into the mountains. I'm not sure the results would have been any different anyway, but failing to meet a teacher that could guide him in his post-satori practice, that was his only option, really. And Hakuin comments, "It is 1,000 pities that because a student fails to encounter a genuine teacher at the beginning of his training and remains ignorant of the practice that continues after satori, he will delight in immersing himself in a pure existence of this kind, cut off from the world. Engaged in such pointless, profitless, silent meditation, he focuses intently on ridding his mind of thoughts and attaining a state of no mind, constantly sweeping thoughts from his mind and doing everything he can to keep it empty and pure." But that is not practice. That's a big misunderstanding about practice. Of course, traditionally in Zen, we are taught to, quote, cut our thoughts, close quote. But that doesn't mean chop. That means to not get attached to thoughts. That means to involve ourselves so deeply and so fully in whatever our assigned practices, whether it's the Susokon, the extended out breath, the koan, or shikantaza, whatever it is, to give ourselves with utmost commitment. I was going to say interest, but sometimes the interest wanes, and that's natural. That we will be sometimes more inclined to sit and sometimes less inclined to sit. And the interesting thing about that is that when we are less inclined to sit, when we really don't feel like doing it, that is the most potent time to sit. Of course, it's also the hardest time to sit, but that's when the deepening can really take place. And then practice will open into a more easily done level. And then it's even more dangerous, really, because we're tempted to simply coast. It feels so good after all that rough water to finally have some smooth sailing. But that's a mistake. We have to keep being curious, keep opening to possibility that something much more deep, much more freeing will appear in our mind, will simply rise up if we keep persisting. And it will, if we keep persisting. But Zen practice is not like our ordinary way of studying. We go to school, we learn that if we study the books, study the lessons, then we can regurgitate the information during our exams, and we've learned something. And there is a sense of progress, generally. And some people have a more difficult time of it, but for many people, there's simply a sense of progress, and we feel good about it. And we learn chemistry, and we learn how to write English or whatever language. We learn our foreign languages, we learn mathematics. And so we're accustomed to that format for learning. But Zen practice is not anything like it. Hakuin, who was also a prolific artist as well as a calligrapher, there's a very famous painting of his called Three Blind Men Crossing a Bridge. You can see it on the cover of an earlier translation, a paperback translation of one of his books. And it is, you'll see these three men sort of stooping down, groping the ground as they try to figure out how to cross this bridge. And that's what Zen practice is like. Roshi Keplo used to say it's like taking a blind person, twirling them around. First of all, you take their stick away from them and twirl them around, shove them to the ground, and then tell them to go home. Only they're so turned around, and they don't have that stick to help guide them, that it's a big confusion. And that's basically Zen practice for a long time. We don't really understand how to do it because there are no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 instructions. We're taught how to sit physically. We're given something to do with our mind or our body, the extended out breath or a koan. And that's as much instruction basically as can be given, because everything else is individual. And since practice is beyond words, we have to feel our way through it, like those blind men feeling their way across that bridge. And it's a good metaphor, because if you go too close to the edge, you're going to fall in the water or off the edge, and heaven knows into what. And so it demands presence, it demands attention, it demands interest. And of course, it's interest that waxes and wanes in practice. We may come into a sesshin roaring to get going, and to really dive in and deepen our practice. Can't tell you how many sesshin I went to in my early years, and Mitra-roshi would always emphasize how important it was. This is the sesshin that I'm going to break through in. Well, no, didn't happen. Didn't happen the next one either. Didn't happen the next one either. Eventually, when I quit trying to set a schedule, things began to go in a more optimal way. The same way with Yaza. This is why at Mountain Gate, Yaza is not a requirement. It's not a requirement in Rochester either. There are places where it is a requirement. And since everyone has different bodies, different circadian rhythms in those bodies, what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. For some people, staying up late into the night works really well. For me, it was deadly. But I could go to sleep right after the end of the evening sitting and get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and sit. And it was deep and it was rewarding. It just felt so, I was just drawn deep. I was so quiet in the Zendo. I was almost the only person there usually. And when I started to feel sleepy, I could go out into the garden and do some kinhin, and the fresh air would revive me, and I could go back and sit again and keep sitting into the morning sitting. So as far as Yaza goes, it's to take stock, not intellectually, but to take stock of a sense of what would work best for you in each given circumstance, because it's going to vary. It's not going to be identical night after night after night. And flexibility can go a long way to helping us deepen in our practice. At any rate, this man Zenkai got into this self-delivered practice of trying to cut his thoughts, trying to shut down his thoughts, trying to reach a mind state of self-determined purity and without thoughts. And of course, there are many writings in Buddhism that speak to that, but it doesn't happen from trying to do it. If we're trying to get into a mind state, all the more so if we're trying to get back into a mind state that felt really good at one point, it's not going to work, because we are riding on top of any sense of reality, really, with such an artificial goal in mind. Zen practice is about surfing the moment as it is, with curiosity, with openness to possibility that something really important could be realized in that moment, no matter what that moment feels like. It can feel really, really bad. And you will see that Zenkai had a most amazing experience as a result of that. For 40 years, Zenkai continued to reside in the hermitage he built in Mino. With growing age, his resolve began to falter. His heart grew weary. He found that the more he tried to sweep thoughts from his mind, the more confused his mind became, understandably. Although having lived in a considerable age as a Buddhist priest, as death approached, his fears of the sufferings that lay ahead of the next world remained. He began quietly to recite the Nembutsu. That's the Pure Land practice. Namo Amida Butsu. I put my faith in Amida Buddha, with the intention of, after death, becoming reborn in the Pure Land. When in time he came to regard this as a rather roundabout way of reaching awakening, he started repeating his own name instead, Zenkai, 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 over and over. Where had the original attainment he'd experienced as a young monk gone? Now his nights were plagued by bad dreams, his days tormented by troubling thoughts. He visited various Buddhist teachers seeking their advice on how to break through this impasse. They told him he was suffering from Zen sickness and could offer him no help. He took to moping about and doing zazen with tears in his eyes. One priest, feeling pity for him, said, "Why don't you go to Suraga province and see Master Kokurin," who was Hakuin. Kokurin was his original Buddhist name. He named himself Hakuin later. "I'm sure he'll be able to help you." So, with considerable difficulty owing to his great age, the priest made his way to my temple in Suraga and earnestly requested an interview. The monk who received him came to my chambers with a smile on his face. A grubby old priest with a broken down old pilgrim's case on his back just showed up, he reported. His hair is tangled like mugwort. He has a filthy face, and his robe and sedge hat are in tatters. He requested an interview with you in a gruff accent of the Bandol region. Will you see him? I said, "Tell him I'm sick, give him something to eat, and then send him on his way." Then I heard a voice shouting loudly from outside the gate, "I'm an old man. I'm over 80 years old. I had a very long trip to come here. Are you going to pretend you're sick and just send me away? Where is your compassion?" So I had little choice but to grant his request. He came into my chambers. "I've suffered for years from Zen sickness," he blustered. "Please, Master, in your great compassion, do something for me. Help me." "Well, tell me about your Zen sickness. What's it like?" I asked. "I'm troubled by thoughts in the daytime. At night, I have bad dreams," he replied. "Do you know what is having those troubling thoughts?" I asked. "Stop, please. I can't bear to think about emptiness," he said. "What's wrong with thinking about emptiness?" I asked. "If a person attaches to emptiness, he'll surely fall into hell." "Come a little closer. I'm going to free you from your suffering." "I'm certainly glad of that," he said, and drew towards me. "Do you know how many hells exist for someone attached to emptiness?" I asked him. "No, I don't know," he replied. "There are 86, and I want you to go into hell right now and distribute yourself among the 86. Wordless, the priest stared pie-eyed at me. "Come on, get down there. Priests are supposed to save you from hell. What kind of a teacher would try to send a student there?" he cried. "You say you're from Kanto, but it seems you've never heard what Suzuki Shozan said. The direct, rough-hewn spirit of Kanto is very close to Zen. If you were really a Kanto priest, you should be able to jump into hell without a second thought." "Could you?" he asked. "Get down there and explore those hells, one by one, and explore." That is the expedient word here. Explore. Whatever mind state we are in, no matter how much we want to avoid it, to explore it, to really feel what it feels like, to reach to the very edges of it and see if you can discern anything interesting about it. It could reveal something tremendously freeing. And this is what Hakuin is trying to get this old man to do, to face what he has been running from for so many years, to jump right in and explore. So Hakuin says, "Get down there and explore those hells one by one. There's not a single one I haven't fallen into." And he abruptly prostrated himself before me. His eyes had filled with tears. "What a great and wonderful teacher you are, Master Hakuin," he said. "Your compassion has liberated me, allowed me to break completely free from my delusions. I feel as though I've suddenly awakened from a terrible dream. There's no way I can describe the joy I now feel." And he prostrated himself 20 or 30 times, crying and laughing all the while. He then left, returned to the guest quarters, latched the door shut, and went to sleep. The next morning, Zenkai approached me with a broad smile on his face. I asked him whether he'd had any bad dreams during the night. I hadn't enjoyed a sound sleep for over 40 years, he said, but last night I slept like a log. It's the difference between a mediocre physician who always doles out the same medicine to his patients and a great one who prescribes a purgative at just the right time. If you'd not applied that purgative just when you did, how could you have saved me from that terrible sickness? When he finished speaking, he performed, I don't know how many prostrations before me. I myself was overcome with joy. I spelled out to him in slow and deliberate terms the importance of the practice that comes after Satori. I also gave him a piece of paper inscribed with the 4 universal vows. That's the Bodhisattva vows. He came to me days later, made his parting bows, and with a mixed feeling of joy and sorrow, went on his way. From Shoinji, he traveled to Edo, where he took up residence in a hermitage. He formed the habit of facing toward the west, the direction of Shoinji, making his vows and mournfully weeping. How fortunate I was to encounter a venerable priest who pushed me down into the great hells. I trod the karmic roots tying me to birth and death into the dust. I kicked over the mill, churning out evil passions in that old den, and I attained the wonderful joy and peace of the great deliverance. Yet, if I become satisfied with this, I'll turn out to be just like Mokuami. And the story of Mokuami is Mokuami was an old blind beggar. However, his voice sounded just like that of a nobleman who was dying. And the nobleman did not want anybody outside of his household to know that he was dying, because he wanted his young son to come of age and therefore inherit the position without any interference. And so they brought in Mokuami, who could sound just like the nobleman. And the nobleman died, and Mokuami played the part for some time. Actually, there is a Japanese movie, and I think it's Ron, maybe. At any point, it describes it. It shows this thing where this man was not blind, but he was indigent, and had the appearance that was identical to the man that he replaced, who had died. And at a certain point, he made a mistake and was kicked out. I went back to being an indigent man. And the same happened with this Mokuami. As soon as the young man came of age and was able to take over his father's position, Mokuami was put back on the streets. And he says, throughout the past, there have been those who sank into the morass of this emptiness after attaining enlightenment because they trusted in their own arbitrary views. Fond of citing phrases such as, "A man with no matters in his mind is truly noble," preaching notions like those of Taoist hermits in the tradition of Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu, they declared that the true happiness is found in the total detachment of emptiness. They squandered their precious time on earth, leading a shameless life in accord with their own self-centered lights. And as a result, they piled up incalculable stores of evil karma, unaware that they were destined to fall into the evil paths forever. This is Hakuin's language. You're getting a window into Hakuin's personality now. He was quite a dynamic speaker, and must have been something as a teacher. But he goes on for quite a while about what this man Zenkai supposedly thought and did. And finally, it reaches the point where in this last bit of talk by Zenkai, he says, why does no one expound such a teaching in this period of the latter day, the diminishing of the Dharma? I've heard from Kokurin that this verse well describes National Master Gudo's style of Zen. Imagine how joyful Master Gudo must be dwelling within the great Samadhi at having acquired such a Dharma son. A Dharma son who excels his Dharma father. It is for this reason that even when I sleep, I never allow my feet to face west in the direction of Hakuin's temple, because that would be dishonoring. After uttering words like these, old Zenkai always prostrated himself in tears. When I heard how he was always praising me in this way, I held my nose a little higher in spite of myself. Zazen is such an adventure, such an amazing adventure. But when we are conditioned to hold life at arm's length for fear of being in pain, and that usually comes when we've had enough pain in our life, we really don't want any more, we lose out a great deal, because in going right into the experiences, Hakuin instructed Zenkai to jump into those 86 hells and explore them. Explore any sense of discomfort, any sense of fear. Walk into the edges of it as far as you can. Gets too big, too difficult, back out a little, and then walk in again. And as you do this again and again, you gradually eat away at the conditioning, and little by little, it'll change in positive directions. So jump into life, jump into this Zazen, jump into whatever it offers to you with joy and gratitude, because as someone said a long time ago, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. And if you persist, it will indeed set you free. But you have to persist in appropriate directions, and not like Zenkai, become your own teacher. It's important to have guidance from someone who's even a half a step ahead of you on the path, which basically Zen teachers really are. There's nothing special about us other than we have gone down the same path. We've experienced the same obstacles, the same challenges. We've been relatively successful in working with them. So we can give you some instructions on how to do it yourself if you encounter the same ones. So I think that's enough for today. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows. And we still have some time left. So we will go back to sitting as soon as we finish reciting the 4 vows. And I'm trying to figure out how to end the recording. It's not clear to me. If I had better eyesight, it would help. There we go.